Hello, my name is Andrew Gary, and welcome to Seismic Sound Off, in-depth conversations in applied geophysics. In this episode, I speak with Michael Burianyk on his new book, Understanding Amplitudes, Basic Seismic Analysis for Rock Properties. In this episode, Michael explains why Newton's ideas still matter despite Einstein, how to approach machine learning with healthy skepticism, why real data can be a hindrance to learning, and why he took the time to discover who was R. Hill. This is a conversation that scientists of all experiences will benefit from and learn. Visit seg.org/podcast for the links to Michael's book and his episode discussing his first book, Understanding Signals. This episode is brought to you by TGS. TGS offers a wide range of energy data and insights to meet the industry where it's at and where it's headed. TGS provides scientific data and intelligence to companies active in the energy sector. In addition to a global, extensive, and diverse energy data library, TGS offers specialized services such as advanced processing and analytics, alongside cloud-based data applications and solutions. Now, for our conversation. Well, I'm excited to speak with you. I was excited when Susan was telling me that this new book was coming out. And your new book, it's called Understanding Amplitudes, Basic Seismic Analysis for Rock Properties. Your previous book was titled Understanding Signals. Why do you think it's important to explore these important topics from this foundational level?
I have a difficult time answering this. I mean, in a polite way. So let me try. So my experience, and I think the experience of a lot of other colleagues I've spoken to about this, is that people tend to take the easy way out. They learn how to use software, they learn workflows, and they have at least some sort of mental checklist of things that need to be done. And this is really the least they need to do to get some sort of product. But they don't necessarily understand what they're doing or why. And, to be fair, I've done this myself, I think, as we all have. But for really reliable results, you have to understand things and to be able to evaluate the results you get. Otherwise, you're in the dark. And you absolutely have no idea how reliable your work is. And I had a lot of discussions with the volume editor, John Logal, who was very encouraging and who really thought that a book like this was necessary, especially for younger professionals who didn't necessarily get a good grounding in the subject.
Yeah, and in the book, kind of building off of this idea of keeping it simple, you say in the book that motivation came in part from creating training for a startup company you were working with. And you even say that you wanted to offer an apology if it might insult the reader for writing about these basic concepts. I'm curious, what was it in creating that training for that company where you realized, I need to start from a more simple framework with this training?
Yeah, well, I guess it was the realization that maybe I didn't quite understand things as well as I thought. And I definitely didn't understand it in the details that I needed to guide development of training apps. So you have to explain things to the developer, even some who have some geophysical background. And somebody said, I don't know whether it was Einstein or Ernest Rutherford or even Richard Feynman or somebody else, who said that if you can't explain it, you don't understand it. And I think there's a lot of truth to that. And again, maybe just the way I think, but I don't really trust anything till I've, as much as I can, simplified things to the basics. So, the initial thing, as I said, was working with developers, programmers, just actually similarly to my first book.
Well, I appreciate you writing from this basic level. I mean, obviously, the For Dummies books have been an extremely successful version. People obviously have a clamoring for this type of information. What is kind of the Cliff Notes summary of this book?
So the book is about how physical properties of rocks affect seismic waves and how we can analyze seismic data in a way that reveals those properties. And it's written for students of geophysics, early professionals, and really for anyone who needs an introduction or a reminder to these subjects of rock physics, ABO, seismic inversion, and amplitude analysis in general.
That's a great summary there. I mean, the book itself, it's a nice, concise book full of, every word on the page matters. You're not wasting any space, which is great. I was curious, why was it important for you to show that real people contributed to the topics discussed in your book?
Oh, I think that everybody deserves to be recognized for their work, for their contribution. In seismic and seismic analysis, in geophysics in general, we tend to throw names around just as labels. And some of us have been lucky enough to actually know some of the some of the people whose names we use, but some of them are long gone. And so I really think it's important to have some little recognition that these people were humans just like ourselves, and we could have maybe have worked with them if in some circumstances, and even to remind us that maybe we're working with people like that now, whose names will be remembered in the future.
Was there a particular individual who you mentioned in the book for their contributions that you weren't very familiar with until you started writing the book?
Yeah, it was interesting for me about the time that I took to find out the first name of R. Hill. And as it turned out he was a he. He's mentioned in our literature as the author of the Hill average. And it's a really simple enough concept, at least superficially. So you have to ask yourself, why bother? Who cares what his or her first name is? Who cares if it's he or she? But it was really important for me, and finally tracking down Rodney Hill and finding out a little bit about this, a quite influential British material scientist was very satisfying. And I'm also a bit disappointed about the people I didn't mention. As fellow Canadians, I have a lot of respect for Brian Russell and Dan Hampson. And Brian, in particular, I think that his shadow was over me while I was writing this, even if I didn't explicitly recognize it at the time.
Why do you say that?
Just because I don't know, because I knew him. I knew him. I still know him. Uh, I know him quite well. I had a lot of interaction with him, but he and his software and the work that he's done I think, has done a lot to popularize the field of amplitude analysis of ABO and inversion and so on through his software and through his papers and presentations.
Well, rewinding a bit, maybe before software was so popular, why are older ideas about extracting rock properties still relevant in understanding the current scientific wisdom?
Simply because they are relevant.
Hmm.
So, the Zoprist equations are over a century old. I think 1920 is the date I have on the original paper. And the so-called Aki-Richards formulations of Zoprist are over half a century old. And the Shuey equation and all these other similar, that were proprietary equations are almost as old and maybe even slightly older. So we still rely on them to calculate things. And it's not even just for understanding, but we actually use them. And, it gets back to using software and just clicking the right buttons. The button clicks are still based on these older ideas, and more modern methods like machine learning, statistical analysis, and so on are still based on all of these older concepts. So, similarly, Newton's ideas are still important despite Einstein.
Why is it more correct to call ABO analysis amplitude versus angle?
Right. Well, I'm always a bit embarrassed by this question. I want to say, isn't it obvious? Why does it need explaining? I know, but it does. And I guess it's what's in a name. We call the concept AVO, amplitude versus offset, and it's stuck. And it's easy to think of it that way because that's how we measure and record it. We record the seismic with offset. But we wouldn't have been interested in recording it or looking at it with offset if we didn't understand that the amplitude changes with angle of incidence. So, I think we've lost the battle for the name, and I'm not even sure if there really even was much of a battle. So ABO it is. But that's okay as long as we understand why.
Yeah, that could be an interesting thing to poll geophysicists to see how many how many understand that. I'm sure it's an important contribution in this book. Why did you stay away from using real data to elucidate the concepts in this book?
Yeah, uh, maybe it's just my search for the Platonic ideal, and it made maybe that's my character. I'm a perfectionist, but really, I think that real data is messy, and it's not just because it can be noisy, but there are all sorts of other effects that we don't really understand very well. So I think that real data can be a hindrance for understanding, and my main goal was just that, understanding. So it's really a lot more insightful to create perfect data and analyze that to see how well the concept fits. And after all, if it doesn't work for perfect data, it's never going to work on the real stuff. And I just want to add to that there are a few things that annoy me about the geophysical community, and one of those is quote unquote, it's too theoretical. I never understood that attitude. If it's not theoretical, it doesn't mean anything.
Hmm. Was there a particular chapter that you wrote in this book that really stood out to you, the most enjoyable to write, or you got the most out of just in your own knowledge and learning?
I suppose it was chapter 8, quantitative amplitude interpretation. So these were all concepts that I was, quite well aware of, but I don't think I was really fully appreciative of them all. And I really enjoyed going through them and getting a new awareness of them. And, I've been accused by some people of being obsessive about cross plotting. I'm a sucker for really good cross plotting software. And I realized earlier when I was working with some software developers that that concept wasn't really intuitive of being able to plot two data sets against each other. So I had a lot of fun making up a silly example to explain it. And I think I also enjoyed parts of Chapter 9, seismic amplitude inversion. I've always been fascinated by the more philosophical implications of inverse theory, and I think that writing about flying teapots was a lot of fun.
Yeah, this is a an easy book to read in that sense. Like you keep it light and fun while still providing the concepts that matter. Was there an insight that you gained about amplitudes through writing this book, a new understanding maybe that you had?
I'm not sure about any one insight, but there were lots of little detailed insights that I didn't quite appreciate before. I did know that simple synthetic seismograms were limited in terms of their way of explaining amplitude behavior of seismic, but not sure I really appreciated the full extent of it. And I knew that seismic deconvolution was a difficult process, but I really didn't appreciate the extent of that either. John Logel, the volume editor, made some really valuable insights into interpretation that I hadn't really considered before. And one of my old bosses from Shell, Ed Biegert, who was the managing editor of the book, asked, why do seismic velocities increase with depth, as does density, when increased density should decrease the velocities? Now, I still don't have a great answer for this. I just sort of, stuffed it over and said that's rock physics. But, I know the question exists now. And, one other, well, I guess there was really one major insight, and that gets back to the question of interpretation. I think that writing the book made me realize quite explicitly that there's a huge difference between seismic analysis and interpretation. So analysis is a geophysical problem, but the interpretation of it, figuring out what it means, is a geological problem. And I think being more technically oriented, this is something that I don't necessarily always properly recognize. So that was a good thing.
Do you see a way that these two books, understanding signals and understanding amplitudes, that they interact and complement each other?
I guess they're both about basics. It's the skeleton of their fields on which the reader can, I don't know, start hanging muscle and sinew, I guess. Understanding signals, the concepts that underlie it in turn underlie amplitude analysis. We're talking about signals in both cases and how to analyze them. So I think one is based on the other, if only conceptually. The philosophy is the same, I think.
What is one idea or question you hope the reader takes some time to consider after reading this book?
One idea. Boy, there's so many. Maybe it's the inversion section again. There are a lot of misconceptions about seismic inversion and about what you can force it to do. The philosophical concepts about the reliability of any one inversion, I think, is pretty important. And I do wish I had the time to look at statistical methods. I didn't, but I hope that I gave a hint or two as to how important statistics can be, and maybe how more modern things like machine learning can be problematic. And again, how you have to understand what's going on. And maybe when I think about it, much of what I was trying to present is healthy skepticism. What things are and their limitations in real life, despite not having real data.
Well, when you have to put your thoughts and your knowledge into a book, I'm sure you have a lot of questions and a lot of thinking and reflecting to do. My last question here, is there one piece of advice you would offer someone looking to succeed in your field?
I think it's understand the basics. I remember when I started working in this field, I spent a lot of time looking at the literature in the field, the original papers, and that I think is important. Again, putting names to things, using labels is one thing, but to understand how those labels came about, who did them and what they actually mean, and even how simple concepts are taken from a paper that's, say, a lot more complicated. The writer was trying to say something else, but this one little thing that he or she added is turns out to have been a lot more popular. I'm just a great believer in understanding things and seeing where everything came from and the basics.
Well, you're living that out in these two books that you wrote and in the work that you're doing. So I appreciate coming back on the second time to talk about this new book, and excited I'm sure, to get this in the hands of many more readers. And maybe I'm sure that they're going to learn something by reading this book.
Well, thank you, Andrew. I appreciate it.
Thank you for listening to SEG's flagship podcast, Seismic Sound Off. SEG produces these episodes to benefit its members, the geophysics community, and inform the public on the value of the science. To show your support for the show, please share this episode with a friend, colleague, or manager that would enjoy hearing this show. Your recommendation is the single best action you can take on behalf of SEG's podcast. To receive the latest episodes first, follow Seismic Sound Off on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or Google Podcasts. The SEG podcast team is Ted Bakamjian, Kathy Gamble, and Allie McGinnis. Thank you for listening. This is Seismic Sound Off, signaling off.